This is the Civil War, Day 11. So far, we've learned about the causes of the war and some of the effects of the war, and today you're going to learn the rest of the effects that we're going to focus on. And this really has to do with what are the effects for people that used to be slaves. So I want you to be listening for what are the good things or the positive things, and the negative things or the negative changes, the bad things for African Americans after slavery has ended in the South. So we're specifically talking about the area of the South and newly freed slaves. So as I read again, listen for the good things and the bad things that have been happening for them since slavery's ended. Here we go. Life after slavery in the South. The end of the Civil War brought an end to slavery, but many hard adjustments lay ahead for white Southerners and their former slaves. Both groups had to figure out how to survive under a new social and economic system. How did the people of the South meet these challenges? 5 days after the war ended, President Lincoln was shot and killed. He had planned to bring the nation together quickly and fairly. After his death, the national government would treat the South more harshly. The Civil War left much of the South in ruins. Fighting had destroyed houses and farms, since Union armies had burned cities. Many Southern citizens had died at the hands of Union soldiers as well. The end of the system of slavery became official when the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect in 1865. This was one of a series of laws and government actions that Congress ordered as it worked to reunite the country. At the bottom, there's a picture of Charleston, and in Charleston, South Carolina, it is pretty much left in ruins after the war is over. They have a lot of rebuilding to do. On the next page, it says, the end of slavery hurt the Southern economy, which was largely built on farming. Much of that farming depended on the work of slaves. Moreover, many white landowners had spent much of their wealth on buying slaves who were now freed. Since most slaveholders viewed slaves as property, they believed that they had lost their investment. Social life in the South had placed whites and African Americans in strict roles. Whites owned the land, while African Americans did the work. Reconstruction overturned this way of life. The 14th Amendment was passed, which granted former slaves citizenship and the same basic rights as other Americans. For a while, life improved for former slaves, but white Southerners resisted these changes and tried to keep African Americans in their old roles. A new way of life. What might former slaves have thought at the end of the war? They were finally free from imprisonment and cruel treatment, and they could go where they wished. There was even a rumor that the government would give them each 40 acres and a mule. During Reconstruction, Congress set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help those in need in the South. Mostly it was designed to give assistance to former slaves. The Bureau started thousands of schools that helped freed slaves learn to read and write. They also gained other skills that could help them earn a living. At this time, federal soldiers protected black voters from whites who did not want them to gain political power. The 15th Amendment gave freedmen or former slaves the right to vote in elections. In some places, African Americans cast votes to elect friendly candidates to the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the courts. But making their own way in the South proved difficult for former slaves. They did not get free land, and many whites kept freedmen from building better lives. At the top, there's a picture. It says during Reconstruction, the government set up schools so that former slaves could learn important skills. Here, African American women are learning how to sew. On the next page, we start with a new farming system. Some white Southerners wanted to make the new situation work. Plantation owners had always depended on slaves to work their fields, but now slavery was a thing of the past. The men and women that planters had once treated as property were free. Many planters decided to try something new. They hired former slaves and had them work in the fields, but this time for payment. However, the slaves would not be paid in dollars and cents. For years, the freed slaves would work the planters' land and get a share of the crop in return. The former slaves would be their own bosses by renting sections of the land and raising their own crops. They would pay for the land, seed, and tools by giving the landowner a share of their crops. Many former slaves agreed to this system, which was called sharecropping. In some ways, life for the sharecroppers did not change all that much. Again, African Americans worked the land for a white landowner while using his tools and animals to plant as seeds. They lived in the same shabby houses that slaves had lived in a few years earlier. The portion of crop that these workers got was usually not enough to live on, as white landowners did not give them a fair price. and the landowners charged the freedmen very high rates to use his farming tools and equipment for other supplies. In many cases, sharecroppers ended the year owing money to the landowner. At the bottom, it says, next to the picture, African Americans who became sharecroppers still lived like slaves in many ways. Here, 2 girls in Mississippi pick cotton. And the last page, Southerners Clash. As more and more plantation owners learned about sharecropping, the system spread across the South. Although a few former slaves were able to prosper, many fell into a cycle of poverty and debt. Still, many whites were angry that former slaves had the ability to rent land. In Mississippi, white landowners wanted to pass a new law that made it illegal for white planters to sell or rent land to former slaves. However, African Americans fought against the unfair sharecropping agreements and laws. They formed groups to help educate and support each other. White Southerners feared that such groups would help African Americans. Mobs of white Southerners would attack gatherings of African Americans and threaten black leaders. In fact, some white Southerners formed their own special groups to terrorize freedmen. One example was the Ku Klux Klan, which became famous for the long white robes that members wore. At night, Ku Klux Klan members would storm the homes of African Americans and kill them. By 1877, all federal troops had left the South, and Reconstruction was officially over. White Southerners recognized this and began using fear to keep African Americans from voting. The Ku Klux Klan and other terror groups could now act freely. They became strong all across the South. Southern states passed laws to separate blacks from whites and to limit the rights of African Americans. These became known as the Jim Crow laws. Some African Americans left the South as they saw no way to achieve true freedom there. One group known as the Exodusters moved to Kansas, where they started farms and built communities. A few freedmen even moved back to Africa. For former slaves who stayed in the South, things would continue to be difficult. Slavery had ended, but true freedom would remain out of reach for some time. At the top of the page, there's a picture that says, many white Southerners were angry that slavery had been ended. They clashed with freedmen once Reconstruction had ended. Your job is to fill in this table. On the left, I would like you to write the positive changes for freed African Americans in the South after the Civil War. And on the right, in the negative changes column, I would like you to tell me what were the not so great things or the negative bad things that happened in the lives of African Americans in the South after the Civil War. Please make sure you go back in the reading for answers. Do your very best. Thank you.